Couple of things I want to talk about tonight, but one in particular, and I'd probably start most streams with that sort of line, because there is one important thing I want to touch on. Lockie 1987, Lockie, good to see you. I want to talk about finishing, or more accurately, extra maturation, and how it's not the devil, and how it can be used quite effectively, and how it's quite important, and what it is. And I want to go over those sort of things, and how it's not an actual science, but it's an interesting way that people can discover whiskey. It's an interesting way for whiskey maturation. It's an interesting development into casks, which is a relatively recent phenomenon. And I mean recent in terms of the last 2 to 3 decades. But they may have been happening in a different capacity before then. But that's not known, and the industry's changed so much, especially in the last 60 years. So I'd argue that probably not. But I'm talking, for those who are just tuning in now, and Ducket Bucket, Hillwood, Benoit, Monster of Malt, Malt Music, Matt Music, Matt Music, and Sable Scotch. So what I'm talking about tonight is extra maturation, the extra maturation of whiskey in a cask. Let's go over some of what let's talk about definitions for a moment before we dig into it, and I take some of your questions. So first of all, I want to mention what extra maturation means in context. It means whiskey that has been matured in a cask, usually, I should say, well, actually no, always, matured for the minimum amount of time that it needs to be matured to be called whiskey, so 2 years in most countries, 3 in Scotland, before it then gets re-racked, gets moved from one cask to another, the spirit gets moved from one cask to another for a period of extra maturation. We at the Society have a belief that extra maturation means that it's matured for at least a minimum of 3 years longer in the extra cask, which means that it actually has a full term of minimum maturation in an additional cask. So it's actual extra maturation as opposed to finishing. Now, finishing we treat as a term to mean whiskey that has had maybe a brief interaction with an additional cask, where it's applied a finish to that whiskey rather than an extra maturation. There is a distinct difference here that I want to make mention of. So Scott, thanks for joining. Sally, thanks for joining. Teague, thanks for joining. So what this means is, what I'm referencing is the fact that there's differences between extra and finishing. Finishing, as done by the likes of Balvenie, as done by the likes of Glenmorangie, they were two of the biggest. I would hold up a full Glenmorangie bottle for you, but I don't have one. But this is also not a finished whiskey. This is a 10-year-old Glenmorangie. But they are very well known for their finishing. And of course, I held up a Balvenie 21 Portwood there as well, which is also a finished whiskey, not an extra maturation whiskey. But I want to make that difference clear and talk about what that means and what the difference is. So, a whiskey with a finish to it applied to it. That might mean that it's a whiskey that has been, let's say in this case, 20.5 years in ex-bourbon barrels, and then 6 months in Portwood. Why would you do that? Because that's the flavor profile they're looking for. It's okay to do that. Finishing is okay. This is a single malt, not a single cask. But this is an example of a Portwood matured extra maturation whiskey, where it's spent time in ex-bourbon barrels for, let's say, I reliably informed that it's between 20 and 20.5 years in ex-bourbon before being transferred to Portwood barrels, or port pipes, I should say, or port seasoned casks, which are then finishes that whiskey for a different flavor profile, giving it a port sort of finish. There's 2 ways of knowing that. One, it's called Portwood, and it doesn't say just Portwood, it says finished in Portwood casks. And the other way of knowing that is the colour, which is a little bit more ruby-ish, a little bit more pink than most standard Balvenies. The same goes for Glenmorangie. This is the original. I don't actually have an extra maturation Glenmorangie in the office, so I can't really use that as an example, I'm sorry. But this is an example of a distillery that pioneered finishing along with Balvenie. When I say pioneered, I mean that they were the ones best known for doing it. They did not, however, invent it. Arguments as to which distillery came first in inventing finishing always happen, so I'm not going to go into that discussion, but you can ask me. Some people say it was. Some people actually reckon it was. Some people reckon it was Glenturret. That's a good guess. I don't know. Glenturret, but Glenturret also have the claim of being the first or they also like to use the claim of being Scotland's oldest whiskey distillery, which is dubious at best as well, because that's very hard to prove that they were the first whiskey distillery. In fact, they're not. I mean, but they're the oldest. Sorry, the oldest whiskey distillery operating in Scotland is one of their claim. So, and then so that's finishing. That's a real basic overview of finishing. What aspect provides the greatest influence to finishing? Is it the previous spirit that has been in that cask, the previous wine or spirit that has been in that cask, or is it the cask itself? There is no exact answer to that. There's no exact science to that. Even I've got a quote here which I've printed out so that I don't get it wrong. Brian Kinsman, who is the malt master at Glenfiddich, says that the previous contents are important, but from his perspective, it's because of what was done to the oak. So he reckons that the wood content, the actual wood itself, American oak, French oak, Russian oak, whatever it is the most important aspect for finishing. It's what the previous oak is. Whereas and he also says that the true transfer of flavour from these previous contents to the next filling is almost nothing. And the way that you can tell that that's the case is if it was a liquid to liquid transfer, you'd get a reaction almost instantly. You'd fill the cask and within days it would have changed, but it doesn't change that quickly. So the easy way to test that is to take a whiskey and just add some sherry to it, actual sherry. Nothing happens. You have to add a bucket load of sherry before you get to the point where you can actually taste the difference. Yes, adding sherry to whiskey will probably change the colour pretty quickly, but not the flavour. So that's his argument for saying that you need to add a bucket load of sherry to justify it being the previous contents being the prime factor in changing that. Whereas he's saying that oak is more important. On the other hand, to almost counter that point in some ways, Dr. Bill Lumsden from Glenmorangie says there's no question, quote, there's no question that by far the biggest influence is the in-drink of the liquid itself, as in what was previously in that cask rather than the cask itself. Some companies argue it's more the oak than the sherry, but that's bullshit. And sorry for the profanities, but that is verbatim Bill Lumsden. So there's an interesting argument for both, and if you've got the malt master from Glenfiddich and the director of whiskey creation at Glenmorangie both having a bit of a tussle over that, you can tell there's no settled science on this just yet, and so it's all very much especially in finishing, can be a bit sort of hit or miss, and some people love finished whiskey, some of the purists hate them. I think disregarding finishing in whiskey is foolish. But then there's extra maturation, which I'll talk about in a moment. I just want to grab some of these people who are asking questions. SMEan asks, I feel like David Stewart gets credited with finishing a lot. Is that even remotely accurate? SMEan, I just want to touch on that very briefly. David Stewart, who is the malt master from, which I want to make sure I get his title right. I think it's malt master or, Balvenie malt master, sorry. David Stewart from Balvenie is often credited for being the... Pine, like he gets credited with finishing. Glenmorangie have been doing it probably just as long, or if not longer. So, and as I said, there were distilleries already doing finishing, such as Glenturret and such as the other one escapes me. It's Glenturret and one other who were doing finishing for almost like 7 to 10 years before Balvenie and Glenmorangie were, like proper time before. Or maybe even longer actually in Glenturret's case. But they weren't calling it finishing. They were just taking single malt whiskey, re-racking it into wine casks or ex-sherry casks, and then releasing a spirit. In Balvenie's case, they call it, there's another phrase which you often hear, which is double wood. That's where it's a bourbon cask matured whiskey that's then finished in sherry casks to add a layer of sweetness. Again, finishing is quite short. It's under 3 years most of the time. So then we'll get now onto whiskey with additional maturation or extra maturation. So that is, extra maturation is a case of where it's a whiskey that has had a significant amount of time, usually in the first type of cask, and then has had extra maturation in another type, not a finish. That would be a good example. Would be from our current out term, of which I can safely tell you there's one bottle left on the website of this. So if you're keen, 5.70 in the absence of convention. I'll hold that one up there. Now this is a Distillery 5 from the Lowlands. and it's a sherried whiskey. It's a lovely, clean sherried whiskey as well. This one. I'm going to pour a dram of that whilst I'm talking about it. Just a little one of that one. It's called In the Absence of Convention. It says here, aged Riesling wine, Armagnac and Calvados joined roasted chestnuts, apples and figs with cinnamon sticks. That's just the brief tasting note. But then it says previously in an ex-bourbon hogshead. So bourbon hogshead being 245, 250 litre cask. But this is previously in a bourbon hogshead for 15 years. And then was in a first fill ex-Oloroso sherry hogshead for 3 and a bit years. So that's an extra maturation. That's where it's had 3 years in sherry rather than 3 months or 3 days in the case of a finishing. Well, 3 days wouldn't really happen for finishing. But this is exactly what it means by extra maturation. It actually allows a lot more spirit integration with the secondary maturation from one single cask to another. It's still a single cask whiskey by definition. Some distilleries do their own single cask releases where they might be racking those casks dozens, if not hundreds of times, but this is literally from 1 to 1, and it has provided another layer of maturation to the spirit, and as you can see from that nice rich amber sort of colour, a lovely rich sherry note going on there, which hasn't been sort of felt like a finish. Doesn't feel like I'm drinking a slightly sweet ex-bourbon cask whiskey. So if you like finishing, I challenge you to try extra maturation. Let me grab some of these questions. Full maturations would crush the spirit. Hold on, I missed the previous comment from you, Scott. The spirit of some distilleries is so light and delicate. If they want to use things like fortified wine casks, sherry port, whatever, finishing may be their only option. Yeah, that's true. Finishing may be the only option, Scott. I fully respect that. I was actually going to get to that point about how the spirit character plays a huge part in that. In fact, Scott, this is your favourite distillery, I would argue. It's a Lowland distillery, number 5. Scott, this is one of your favourite distilleries, is it not? I know you're not a fan of this distillery. That's okay. But I think in single cask form, it can be quite a delicious whiskey, actually. So, and I'm not a huge fan of this distillery either. But I don't buy society releases. I don't drink society releases based on distilleries. I base them entirely on tasting notes and flavour profiles because they're so atypical of the house style, such is the nature of single cask whiskey. Whiskey Steens Tim asks, what do you gain from extra maturation / finishing that you don't get from blending different casks? Well, in this case of a single cask, Tim, as you know the society does, this is going from one cask to another. We don't get the opportunity to do blending very often, except for when it's our Heresy bottlings like Exotic Cargo and Pete Fairy and Old Fashioned and things like that, and even one coming up as well called Beachcomber, which I can't tell you much about at the moment, but that's very exciting. What do you gain from extra maturation? You gain a different flavour profile, Tim. You gain an opportunity to take a spirit that has already taken a bit of time in a cask and add some extra maturation to actually expand out the flavour a bit. So that, I would argue that pre-finishing pot was a 15-year-old single cask that was possibly quite light, quite interesting, but maybe could have used a bit of something different. So would have been a case of going, well, we've got some great sherry casks that might improve that spirit. And it's a bit of, like I said, there's no exact science to it, but it can certainly change the flavour profile quite dramatically. And can add a totally different dimension, especially extra maturation, but even so with finishing. And I'm a huge fan of both in different contexts. Whiskey fan 888, thanks for joining. Petros, thanks for joining. Adrian, thanks for joining. Whiskey Tray, thanks for joining. So this is a sweet, fruity, and mellow profile. So I'm going to rewind to 1983. There's two things that happened in 1983 that are quite significant. One is that the Scotch Malt Whisky Society was founded. That's fine. Second thing I'm going to mention is that David Stewart, the malt master at Balvenie, created Balvenie Doublewood. Now, back then it was called Balvenie Classic, and it was a 10-year-old whiskey, and it was called Balvenie Classic, and it was extra maturation. It was a finishing. It was a ex-bourbon cask matured whiskey that was 10 years in ex-bourbon, and then a number of months in ex-sherry, just to give it a sweet rounded edge at the end. So there's cool sort of history on both sides there. So there you go. But here, where are we now with extra finishing and maturation? What's happened since then is that you get these. It's, by the way, so like I'll safely say that Balvenie and Glenmorangie pioneered it. They may not have invented it, but they certainly pioneered it. And then, ever since they did, the likes of so many Diageo distilleries sort of have now used that practice as standard for so many of their releases. Even if it doesn't say that it's extra matured, or even if it doesn't say it has a finish, it does, and they don't need to disclose that on the bottle. We like to disclose all the details we can possibly on the label, which is why our labels are a little bit wordy sometimes, and that's okay. I'll show you some examples of it. You don't always need to have extra maturation, of course. I mean, I'll give you two examples here that I've plucked out, and they're both very similar in age, but both in the same flavor profile, but very different whiskies. So on my left here, I've got Cherry Chocolate and Chutney, a 20-year-old whiskey from Distillery 73. Now this spent 17 years. Oh, let me get that right. 17 years in a ex-bourbon hogshead, and then 3 and a bit years in a first fill ex-Oloroso. Very similar sort of maturation policy to the previous whiskey I was just having a nose and taste of. And then, but as an example of something that is not that, but can do full-term maturation, was something like this. A Broadside Cannon Barrage. It's a 21-year-old single cask, full maturation in a first fill Oloroso. If you're a big sherry head, that might be your kind of whiskey. So there's all sorts of different ways of doing it. And then, of course, you can always just go for one of my favorites, of course, which is just ex-bourbon cask whiskey. And hashtag Team Refill. I hope you all get to watch this later. So there we go. A few different things about extra maturation, a few things about finishing and how they're different things. Finishing is basically a lick of the cask. It's a good thing. It means that it can be used to just amplify a flavor profile, try something different, and that would be an example of where you get a Glenmorangie 10 Original, which is one of my favorite whiskies. I'll still be honest. It's when it comes to core range bottlings, it's a banger. You can't go wrong with Glenmorangie Original. But then they have a range of things like a 12-year-old, which has been spent 2 years in that case, so a finish in sherry, 2 years in port, 2 years in things like that. So that's exciting. And then you've got extra maturation, which is now what the SWA are calling, where it's 3 years or more, so a full maturation period of what Scotch whisky minimums can be in another cask. The laws on single cask are also changing at the SWA soon as well, which is exciting because it means that we'll have a bit more transparency from other producers as well. Leading by example, I should say. Look, it's not a big one tonight. I just wanted to go for a 20-minute stream just now, just to talk about the differences between finishing and extra maturation. I hope you've enjoyed this. I'm certainly going to enjoy this. I'll just give you a few of my notes. A few of my notes, I should say. Instantly clean sherry. Like I'm talking like super soft, heathery kind of sherry without a hint of sulfur. But the sherry, again, even with the extra maturation, the sherry hasn't overwhelmed that spirit, as Scotty was talking about before. A very good point from Scott there. It hasn't. It's not overwhelmed the maturation. Extra maturation hasn't overwhelmed that already light, fluffy spirit that Distillery 5 make. It's the only distillery in Scotland that 100% triple distills their spirit, which is uncommon, very uncommon. Wow. Fizzy fruits, ripe apricots, and like a bit of Calvados. Almost like it is almost could be. You could serve this up and it would almost confuse a guest for being an Armagnac, actually. Super Armagnac-y. Which is kind of funny, isn't it? That Armagnac is single distilled and this is triple distilled, yet they share so many similarities. Very strange. The magic of the cask, I guess. Like rice bubbles. Rice bubbles and milk. Bit of cinnamon stick. Lovely. Like it's a super clean, lovely sherried whiskey. With a little bit of bite to it though, which is good. Guess the distillery starts with A then. Yeah, it does. What are the odds, Lockie? I couldn't possibly tell you that, but I guess it does. This was actually not Pep Hill's favorite distillery. There's a famous quote of his where he was talking about this distillery, and he said he was reluctant to bottle anything from them because he thought it all tasted like soap. It's not the most favorite of my distilleries either, but it's certainly one that I think is intriguing in its own right, but is not a. But again, I don't pick off distillery, and I encourage you to do the same. I encourage you to pick off flavor profile and pick through. Disregard the number. Don't focus too much on the number. Focus more on what you're interested in and what the flavors are in that tasting note. Or mine are indeed, but the tasting note is going to be way more accurate. Yeah, what are the odds? The A is followed by a U. Or. Look at that, I got away with the whole stream of not even saying it once. Come on, that's pretty good. And actually, I had other things on the table to show you. I showed you that Balvenie, how that's extra maturation in that. But other distilleries like Glenmurray, one of my favourite distilleries. This is a sherry cask finish. There you go. They even I just want to show you on the label on some whiskey now are taking a bit more I guess license with actually printing the full details on there, which is very cool. So that's where I'm going to leave you for now. Wait, a few more questions from coming in. Tim asks, is there a compound that creates that soap flavour? Some people seem to pick it up with certain distilleries. Whiskey Steam says there are all sorts of manner of complex compounds within the creation of whiskey. I'm talking hundreds, of which I don't know even a fraction of. I'm not a scientist, but I will tell you that there is that soap note that almost is often the case of it's a mixture of spirit and cask. I'll tell you that. It's not just one or the other. And it's a way they interact together. It's not like saying that their spirit is particularly soapy or that cask is particularly soapy. I don't know where that note comes from, and I know but not everyone picks it up. It's a very strange one. I'm going to have to take that question on notice, Tim. I don't mean to sound like a parliamentarian, but I will have to take that on notice and actually do a bit more research on it, because I think it's one that is worth discussing. I was very lucky to I was at a tasting. I'll just finish with saying that I was at a tasting with some friends in just a local whiskey club, and a 30-year-old Bamor was opened from an independent bottling of a 30-year-old Bamor, and it was something rather special. It was like, this is a 30-year-old Isla whiskey. It's like it's extremely exciting. It was the least well received in the room, and it was the whole whiskey smelled and tasted like that imperial leather soap, that like Cussons imperial leather, really sort of imperial leather mixed with a bit of vapor rub. It was the peat element. It was not a desirable tasting note, but yeah, I mean that's what I mean. It's sort of like there's lots of different things going on there, but that's a question I'll have to take on that one. A science episode, actually, Lockie, that's a really good point. We should do a science stream on here, because I've got a friend who works in whiskey science, and I'll see if I can get him on. He might be really keen actually, and see how that works out. In the meantime, have a great night. They don't make that soap anymore. What? They don't make imperial leather anymore? Come on, I reckon if you go to your nearest chemist, you'll find one of those 10-pack of, those 10 packs of soap, like actual pieces of soap, not shower gel, like soap. Like there's 10 packs for $1.90 of just soap, and it dries you out every time you use it. Soap thing, I think, is genetic. Same with coriander. If you don't like coriander, I don't know what to say for you. I'm sorry. Coriander's delicious. That's all from me right now. I'll see you all again tomorrow night. Happy dramming, and thanks for tuning in as always. Tonight's been about discovering things about finishing and extra maturation, and I'll see you all again soon. Cheers!